Thank you for joining us. I'm Chantal. I serve as a pastoral ordinate at Redemption Church. We are a radically inclusive community of hope, seeking to live Jesus-centered lives. The message you will hear is from our Sunday gathering, where we seek Jesus, joining one another in communion and worship. Whether you find yourself on the go, have yet to find a local church community to which you can belong, or are exploring your faith, we're so glad you're here. We hope this message brings encouragement, hope, and a deep sense of knowing that you are loved by God. We rely on the generosity of our community, and this includes you, wherever you may find yourself. To get resources like this out into the world, you can contribute at redemptionichu.com/give. Here's this week's message.
We are wrapping up Galatians today, and I can't help myself. But for me, in so many ways, this is actually, and don't blame me, blame Paul, because he's the one that wrote the letter, okay? But so much of this neatly ties to where we're going in the following next few weeks as we enter into the season of Lent. Lent is the contemplation, the meditation of Jesus as he journeys towards the cross, and the real contemplation of that simple command that Jesus gives us to follow him. And today, what I want to do is invite us to, with eyes wide open, really try to grapple with what that might actually mean, where Jesus might be asking us to follow him to, and with what he might be asking us to carry along the way. So we've called this series Mosaic because what Galatians is trying to get at is that what God has done in Jesus Christ is he's brought together this group of people into this thing called the church, the gathering, the community, the ecclesia. And that they don't really share anything in common. And what was so incredible and actually miraculous and awe-inspiring in the first century is what's common for us now was scandalous to them, that you would have a slave and a free person, a citizen of Rome, sitting at a table and sharing a meal together. That was revolutionary. That you would have a man and a woman sitting at a table together, sharing a meal. And that they would do this in a way where it was not a superior talking to a subordinate or sharing a meal with a subordinate. It was as equal sharers. It was as co-heirs in Jesus Christ. And these things that we take for granted because they've been kind of baked into Western civilization are due large in part to Christianity's witness. Now, I know the church has done a lot of really awful things, but we got to give the church some credit there, or at least the Spirit of God that's working in the church, some credit there for breaking down those barriers and those walls. But the reality is it's a mosaic because we don't have things in common. That's not why we're here. We're not here at church because we like each other. That would just make us a social club. And there's plenty of great social clubs in Houston. I would encourage you to go join one if that's what you're in here for. We're not here because we all share the same politics, although we might happen to share the same politics. We're not here even because we share the same ideas about what God is up to in the world, although we might share a lot of that in common. We're here because Jesus Christ has brought us here, and Jesus Christ, who is our Lord, has brought us together and said, now you are one. In your diversity, in your differences, in your disagreements, in your hostility towards one another, I am saying peace to you, church. You are mine, and I am yours, and you are one in me. And this is the plot that the churches in Galatians have lost. And the central issue seems to be the issue of circumcision. The churches in Galatia have been confused by some teachers who are going around saying, hey, look, if you really love God and you really want to be in on God's plan and God's promises, what you have to do is you have to circumcise yourselves. Now, what we find out, and kind of the background here, and we're going to see this in today's text, is that the motivation behind this is not faithfulness. The motivation behind this is not like, well, we're just here fighting for the truth and in love, brother. I just got to tell you the truth. Get a knife, okay? That's not what's going on here. The reality in the first century was the Romans were actually pretty nitpicky about you worshiping their gods. Because there was not this whole secular sacred divide that we have in our world in Western society, that there was a unification of religion and politics. I don't know what that's like. We would never see anything like that in our day. But if you can imagine, And what would happen is if you did not participate in the civic religious practices, anything bad that happened, it was your fault, right? You are the reason that Zeus is cursing the city of Athens. You are the reason that Dionysus is bringing barrenness upon the women of Galatia. And so the not worshiping, or what they would call atheism, of these gods was a problem. And there was one exception to this rule that the Romans have, and it was the Jews. The Jews were obstinate enough and faithful enough and insistent enough and rebellious enough that the Romans finally said, you know what, we're just going to stop trying, and gave them an exception. Y'all can go over here and you can do your thing to your one God. You don't have to come and worship these so-called idols, and you get excused from this. But then you have this sect that rises up that claims a Jewish Messiah, but that isn't actually practicing Jews. And so citizens, neighbors, civic leaders are left with the question of, what do we do with these people who are refusing to come to our temple and worship, but who aren't actually Jews? So like, do we persecute them? Do we not persecute them? At the same time, the Jews are realizing like, oh no, like our special status is under threat here, because these Christians are going to get the Romans thinking, well, anyone can just rise up and go, oh yeah, we're Jewish too, and so we don't have to go worship either. And so what's happening here is there is a pressure to get circumcised so that we can keep it all neat and tidy and clean, and we can all fit into the same category and the same rules in both the Jewish side and the Christian side, and we can go on our merry, happy Roman lives. And so Paul says, if you've got your Bibles, I would encourage you to open up with me to Galatians chapter 6, and we're going to jump down to verse 11. And I want you to see this in his own writing, which is what he says in verse 11. See with what large letters I've written to you with my own hand. All who want to make a good showing in the flesh, right? He's talking about circumcision, are trying to compel you to be circumcised, simply so they will not be persecuted for the cross of Christ. So the temptation in Galatia is the temptation towards an easy life. The temptation in Galatia is towards a crossless Christianity, a crossless Christ, an uncrucified God. I think it's important to remind us when things can feel really unsettled, both in our personal lives and in just the world in general, it's important to remind us that the promise of Jesus Christ is not that you will get the promotion. The promise in Jesus Christ is not that you will go on that vacation that you've always longed to go on. The promise in Jesus Christ is not ease and comfort and wealth and prosperity and happiness and ease. He does not promise us that things will work out the way that we want them to. At least not here and not now. What he does promise us is that love is stronger than death. And that even here and even now, God is with you, and God will not abandon you, even unto death. But if we're being really honest, I think when we doubt this, it's because we doubt God's love for us. Or maybe we doubt God's power. Or maybe we doubt that God would actually even consider us enough to actually bring us back from the dead one day. Maybe we doubt that in the face of the scarcity that seems to be going around with jobs and marriages and loneliness and all these things that seem to be threatening us from the outside, maybe in all this scarcity, maybe God really isn't enough. Maybe the abundance of God doesn't actually really do for me what I need it to do. And so we turn to what Paul calls the flesh, and we try to scratch our own itches in our own ways. And we try to make life a little bit easier, a little bit happier, a little bit sunnier, and we play the world's game the world's way. We make power plays in all the different ways that we think we can. We try to control and coerce and exploit and use and manipulate. And we use up and we wring out people all in the name of whatever ways that we justify it. And we try to get what we want out of life because we're just not convinced that God's really actually enough. This is what Paul will call the old creation, the flesh, the old human. And it's the world that when you entered the waters of baptism, you were leaving behind. It's the world that Paul says is the world that you were crucified to, that he was crucified to. It is a world and a way of being that is dead to you. I came across this painting. It's a 20th century painting by Frank Dixie, and it's called Two Crowns. And as you look at the painting, your eyes will immediately probably be drawn to the center, where you'll find a king who is clearly coming back from some sort of conquering. He stands at the center, dominating the painting. He's adorned in bright colors, riding a majestic war horse. He has majesty and might. He's wearing golden armor that's like intricate and elaborate. He sits atop his war horse, decked out in the strength and victory of battle and domination. Your eyes are drawn to him, and he is a picture of status, of victory, of wealth, of flourishing. And look, he's surrounded by all these women heaping praises and adoration on him, flowering him and looking up to him or bowing down to him. And he's followed by an army of armed men. And on his head is the most ornate crown of gold that you've ever seen in your entire life. And this is the crown that shows us what we think success looks like. Victory, domination, control, winning, adoration, and praise. And while the king dominates the center of our attention, an imposing figure on the canvas, we see that he is somewhat nervously, somewhat unconfidently looking at something else, something in the distance, something on the margins. And in the shadows, we begin finally to see a barely visible, stripped, weak, humiliated, suffering Jesus on a cross. He doesn't dominate the painting. He's not even in the center of it. He sits on the margins quietly, obscurely. He doesn't demand or command attention. In fact, it's probably not what your eyes were drawn to until towards the very end. He's hidden in darkness and in shadow and weakness and obscurity. He's not imposing. He's diminished, likely ignored until your eyes were finally left wandering through the painting to land on him. And this is the second crown. This is God's crown, the crown of thorns. And we see clearly the difference between the flesh and the spirit, between the old creation and the new creation, between God's ways and our ways, but between what we say life is and success is and human flourishing is and what God says, no, this is life. This is love. This is success. This is victory. Galatians is a weird book. It's a tough book. It's a tough nut to crack. Theologians disagree with one another. Thankfully, we don't burn each other these days, so that's good. But we do write really mean things to each other. But I want to give you the interpretive key to Galatians. And when you go back into Galatians on your own, if you can just keep this at the forefront and center of your imagination. In fact, I would actually argue if you go to any place in the Bible and keep this at the center and the forefront of your imagination, you will do well to read the Bible rightly. And that is of a God crucified. Look at verse 14 if you're following along here in your Bibles. While these men are boasting in their flesh, in their law-keeping, in their Torah-keeping, in their status as circumcised individuals, Paul says, "Far be it from me to boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, through which the world has been crucified to me and I to the world." See, the first crown is the crown of the world. The second crown is the crown of God. And the reality is that central to anyone seeking to lead a Jesus-centered life is both the reckoning with and the embrace of a crucified God. And so I want to start with coming to terms with this reality. This is the reckoning. I like that word. It's just a fun word to say. We don't get that one much in pulpits these days. I feel like we need some more reckoning in our lives. But we have to reckon with the cross because we really do, right? And maybe you're not this person, but I find that I really do just want a crossless Christ. And I feel like the mimosa touting, yoga doing spirituality of 2025 really loves the idea of a crossless Christ, right? We don't need a cross, we just need vibes, right? Just set the mood and like turn on the 98 degrees or whatever it is that you do in those hot yoga places. Let's stretch, feel some endorphins flowing, and we have encountered the divine. No, actually you encountered Cindy, and she gets paid $60 an hour, and she was your yoga instructor for the day. We want a nebulous God, an undefined God, a God that can't be too neatly located or defined because that would then like impose something on us. Perhaps too literally here, maybe this is too direct and to the point. We want a God that we can nail down. Pun sort of, kind of, not intended, I don't know. But likely you're here in this room because at some level you're looking for more than vibes. We're not that kind of church. You want something real, something concrete, something that matters, something that's authentic, something that's true. And reckoning with a crucified God means coming to terms with the fact that God comes to us. We don't go to God. And when God comes to us, God shows us what God is like. We don't get to tell God what he is and what God is like. And this is an idea that is utterly foreign and unattractive to us as like Americans in 2025. We like choice. We like to have a say in the matter. I like my Jesus with a tuxedo t-shirt and a mullet, and he's on the front row of a Leonard Skinner concert. You can finish that quote in your own minds. This is church. And we'll look at verse 15. When Paul says, "For neither circumcision is anything, nor uncircumcision, but instead a new creation." Right? The thing you're doing in your flesh to please God, the thing you're not doing in your flesh to please God, all of it means nothing. The crucified God lays waste to all of our power plays, all of our manipulations, all of our attempts at getting to God. And God comes to us and in scandal, in foolishness, in unattractiveness says, this is who I am and this is what I am like. And our religion, our politics, our violence, and all of our junk, our wealth, our status, our power, all of it is crucified with the God of all creation. And all of our efforts are shown to be what they are: empty, meaningless, and vain. And Jesus turns all of this upside down when he says, here's who I am, and here's what I'm like, and guess what? This is who I'm inviting you to be as well. What does Jesus do with status? That status that we are so aching for, that we long for, that someone who is like me is just like, man, I just need someone to whatever, think highly of me, respect me, love me. I've got my scars, don't worry, I'm dealing with it. I got a good therapist, she's great, her name's Virginia. Well, what does God show us about status? And I really need tenure, or I really need to get this grant, or I really need that raise, or I really need this car, I really need these clothes, or I really need that person on my arm, or this person not on my arm, or I really need to get out from this house into that house, or I really need this or that, or whatever it is that we think is going to elevate us to the thing that we think is going to make us lovable or worthy, or whatever it is that we do. But what does the Son of God do with his status? Philippians tells us that he forsakes it. He comes down and becomes creation. Ew. But not just creation, like creation in the first century as a Jew, not even as like a Roman. But then not just as like a Jew, but like as like a poor Jew. But not just as a poor Jew who was crucified in this humiliating and shameful way. Philippians tells us he becomes a slave, a servant, lower than the lowest low. This is what God does with status. And then in turn takes that status that is rightfully his, that he rightfully could have commanded and demanded from all of us, and he freely gives it to you. He says, you want status? Here it is. You can have my status as God's son. It is freely yours. Take it. And what does Jesus do with power? Jesus shows us that God's power is not strength and might and violence, but weakness, humility, and love. And his life is not taken from him, but in love, he freely gives it. He makes this very clear in John's gospel. And what does Jesus do with wealth? The God of the universe who possesses all things, right? The one who holds all things together even now, gives to us his body and his blood, gives to us his very self. And so God crucified is God's participation in our ways of doing stuff, our flesh, our old world, old creation, all the different ways the New Testament talks about it. And God crucified is what it looks like for God to enter into our attempts to control God with our religion and our politics and our bloodlust and our desire for autonomy and our desire to be on the right side of this and the wrong side of that. And crucifixion is the fruit of our flesh. Crucifixion is the fruit that the world bears when the world gets its way. And crucifixion is the fruit of God showing up into our attempts at life and giving himself freely and fully to us, without exception, without compromise, without asterisks. And in this moment, this is where God shows his strength, as the world in all of its ways are powerless over the one who persistently absorbs evil and refuses to return it in kind. And so God on the cross is what God most clearly shows us about who God is and what God is like. You smell what I'm stepping in here, Redemption Church? When we really start to wrap our minds around this, our hearts around this, there's no part of us that is probably excited about this. Yeah, absolutely. This is scary. This is scandalous. And this is the very scandal that those in Galatia were attempting to avoid. They didn't want the cross part. It might have been too costly. And a crossless Christ stays off the cross and just sits back and gives us stuff like the genie in Aladdin and wants us to be happy. But what if there's something more important than our happiness? Something deeper, something more profound, something more at the bedrock of who God is trying to make us. And so once we can begin to reckon with a crucified God, we who lead a Jesus-centered life are now invited to move towards embracing a crucified God. And this is what it means that we are a new creation. Right, so in your baptism, you stood on some sort of water thing or before some sort of water thing. And if you got baptized here, you entered into it and were immersed into it, and you left the old world behind. And if you were sprinkled as a baby or as an adult, same sort of deal. You were crucified with Jesus Christ. You were sharing in his baptism. And as you came out of the waters, being forgiven by the Holy Spirit, you came out of those waters into a new world, into a new kingdom, into a new reality. And you were invited to live in that world as a new person, a new creation, a new creature. And it should be no shock to us that our existence in that new reality looks a lot like Jesus. And we should not be shocked that if in that new reality, the world that treated Jesus the way that it did begins to treat us in the same sorts of ways. Eugene Peterson wrote a pretty great book about this. It's pretty old now. It's written in the 70s, but it still, in principle, stands the test of time. And he says this about those of us who are trying to go back to the other side of baptism, get back into the old world. He says that we're unfree. And the unfree person must defend themselves against the weakness of others who might reject them by their condemning or their denunciation, as if another person's weakness were like contagious and contact would mean infection. And the unfree person must defend themselves against strength of others by rejection, as if another's strength were somehow domination. But when we are released from our self-centered fears, when we trust God's power above our own, then we are free to give ourselves to others. And is this not a description of Jesus Christ on the cross, who freed from self-centered fears entrusted himself fully and finally to God for the sake of others in death? And how did God respond? He brought him back from the depths of death itself. And so at the beginning of the service, when we say, your love endures forever, and we repeated it over and over and over and over again, I wonder if we might begin to actually start to convince our hearts God's love really does actually endure forever. And if we began to believe that, I wonder how that might free us. If we really believed God's love for me endures forever, how we might be able to move freely in the world, differently in the world. When we can let go, believe that God really actually has us, that we are really actually loved, that we don't have anything to prove or earn or hide from, we are free. I think we start to look a lot like Jesus. I think we start to look like the humans that God longs for us to be, and I believe that the shape of this sort of life begins to take the shape of a crucified God. And so Paul tells the Galatians not to devour one another, but instead to bear one another's burdens. And we're not going to go into all of this, but this is not just like, hey, lend your neighbor a cup of sugar sort of thing. What he's really describing there in that first paragraph in Galatians 6 is this idea that like your brother or sister has sinned, and so you're to come alongside them and correct them. Now, I know a lot of us have been in churches where that has been like swell. That has gone really well for us. But the description that Paul has is not one of like standing over the other and be like, hey, you need to get right like I'm right. Instead, it's entering into, there's an ancient church father named Jerome who says, this is you considering their sin as if it were your own. You praying their forgiveness as if it was your own forgiveness. You actually coming alongside them and hoisting them up and walking alongside one another, arm in arm together, almost like the God of the universe does with all of humanity when he comes down and enters into our depths of suffering and sin, taking sin upon himself on the cross, becoming one of us to that extent. So no, it's not a like, hey, no, you need to pray more or you need to stop this or stop that, but it is alongsideness. And then he goes into giving. And whether we like it or not, he's mostly talking about money there. And whether we like it or not, there's just a lot that we can tell about our loves from our money. And myself is included in that conversation. There's a lot we can tell about what we think is going to save us by what we do with our money. But if we're really, truly, actually free, Paul's command is like freely give, freely sow. First to the church and then to those outside the church. Now, lest you think this is about to turn into that kind of sermon, why those in the church? I love the way that Eugene Peterson puts it when he said, because they're there. Because they're the people that you see every single week that are sitting right next to you. And I think this would extend to our next door neighbors and our coworkers, that they are the ones that are right there. We so quickly want to like travel across the world to do something when our neighbor's like, no, actually, I could use some help. But like, no, I can't be bothered with that. That would actually be like too involved. And so what the picture that Paul paints is all sitting on the foundation of a crucified God in chapter 6. N.T. Wright summarizes the message of this chapter by saying, generous, self-giving love is at the heart of Paul's message. It must also be at the heart of the church's lifestyle. And so Paul concludes, and I will conclude with this. Verse 17. From now on, let no one cause trouble for me, for I bear on my body the marks of Jesus. So in Galatians, Paul gets real salty. Okay, at one point he's telling people to like cut off their manhood. It gets aggressive, okay? And the whole conversation is all about like, do you have the right sort of marks in your flesh to avoid persecution? And Paul's like climactic argument point is, I bear in my flesh the marks of persecution. I bear in my flesh the marks of a suffering God. Case closed, end of story. Right? Paul literally bears the marks of his faithfulness to Jesus Christ due to his imprisonment and his beatings and all the things that people have done to him in his persecution. And so he's like, you want to compare flesh? Let's compare flesh and see whose looks more like Jesus. And leading up to this moment, what Paul describes is a church who takes a crucified God seriously. And what I want to invite us into is the question of what would it look like for us to take Jesus seriously? Now, I don't want to stand up here as the pastor and start to answer that question for you, because that goes sideways really fast. I have lots of great ways that you could serve me by doing all those things. But I don't know what God is inviting you into. I don't know what scary endeavor God is saying, hey, I might be asking you to really love in this way or give in this way or do this thing in this way that's like terrifying to you, but I'm still here with you in it. Whether you do it or not, I'm still here with you in it. But I want you to wrestle with that question. And I also don't want to pretend that that thing won't be costly. Because there's this assumption like, well, if I do that, then on the other side of it, like it'll be great, right? I'll get tenfold back. Sorry, not here, not now. That's not how this goes. Wrong church. We should not be surprised when we seek to lead Jesus-centered lives when we're left with scars. Scars in our life, scars on our checkbooks, scars on our careers, scars on our hearts from loving people too freely, scars on our status. I remember once I used to go to this coffee shop in Houston, and I was in seminary at the time, so I'd always bring in these godforsaken, like giant, enormous seminary textbooks, and I'd plop them down in front of the barista. She'd be like, so what are you reading? And it was like this is like the 2010, 2011, right? So it was like hipster land. They're all hipsters. They're behind the counter, godless hipsters, right? And what are you reading? And I'm like, oh, these are some theology textbooks, trying to make it as like cool and relevant as possible. And just the scowl immediately begins to form. And I realize like I'm now shrinking. And they're like, so what do you do? And I tell them I work at this church. It's like a conservative evangelical church at the time. And it's also been associated with some pretty problematic things in the city at the time. And they're looking at me like, really? We should throw you out of here, right? So in this moment, I'm like feeling my status actually being diminished. And I'm walking in trying to be like hip and cool. I live next to the hip, cool coffee shop. And no. Right, and there's some parts of that that are absolutely and utterly unique to me. But I wonder what following Jesus might begin to actually cost us. Maybe your political party just needs to go. Maybe the job is just not the job that you're supposed to be in. I don't know. But I'm convinced that following Jesus is going to leave its mark. And I don't know what that looks like for you. But I do know that your life will bear some form of suffering that's taken on in addition to just all of life's lifeness because of following Jesus. When we embrace the God revealed in Jesus Christ, we find ourselves at odds with the world around us, and there will be like real friction there. There will be real cost there. There will be a real price to pay there. And so what I need you to hear is that when that happens, you're not somehow like on God's bad list. You're not somehow forsaken. You're not somehow abandoned. But you are right in the smack dab center of where God is asking you to be. And God is with you even there. Brian Zond wrote in his book that I'm going to invite us all to read over the course of Lent, but more on that later. He says, contradicting the way of the world is what following Jesus on the demanding road of discipleship is all about. I will always face the temptation to make a Jesus-centered life a life about ease, a life that's somehow happier or more full of leisure and free of cost. But what Jesus offers is actually something better than that, something deeper than that, something far more beautiful than that. A Jesus-centered life may or may not be a happy life, I don't know. But it will certainly be a beautiful life. And the scars of Christ will bear witness to all of the world of God's relentless love for you and for them.
Thank you for listening. I want to remind you that if there's anything we can do to serve you or help you get connected to our community, we encourage you to reach out at redemptionhou.com/connect. We desire to be a community where you are seen, known, and loved. Go out today in the love of the Father and by His Spirit embody the hope of Jesus to the world around you.